Viktor Jeifets is a professor with the School of International Relations at St. Petersburg State University in Russia. And Vladimir Rouvinski is a former George F. Kennan Fellow with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and is director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Icesi University in Colombia. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
They join us today to talk about, they're here for a conference, a two-day conference co-sponsored by the Kennan Institute and the Latin American program at the Wilson Center. And we're going to be talking about Russia's interests and role in the Venezuelan crisis. Gentlemen, let me start by asking about, is this an opportunity for Russia because its ally Venezuela finds itself increasingly isolated from the rest of the international community?
Definitely, because from my perspective, the primary value of Latin America for Russia it's its geographical proximity to the United States. So taking into account that the relation between Russia and the West and the United States primarily reach the new low, I think the value of Venezuela is really high for Russia from that perspective. And Russia is determined to maintain its ties with Venezuela. And I think for Venezuela, it's one of the most important allies it has on the international arena.
Well, I wouldn't say that all Russian foreign policy toward Latin America is a geopolitical one. It has like 3 or 4 models, but in case of Venezuela, I agree completely with Vladimir, is mostly political one, because now as we are living once more a Cold War, Russia needs to demonstrate that it has allies, and Venezuela was one of the few countries which had recognized independence of Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia, and that is when it became important for Russia. And Russia doesn't want a retreat from Venezuela, because if Maduro would be ousted from power, it would politically mean that Russia is losing one of the allies. Perhaps not the biggest one, but it's still an ally. So it's mostly politically determined.
What is the actual level of activity or type of activity for Russia in Venezuela? Is it simply having an ally in the United States hemisphere, or are there actual on-the-ground activities, either economic or otherwise?
Of course, to begin with, Russia did invest important assets in Venezuela. Rosneft, Igor Sechin, one of the one of the individuals who are very close to Vladimir Putin, is the one who is actually promoting the closeness of relations between Russia and Venezuela. And Rosneft, as well as the Russian government, have invested roughly $20 billion into the Venezuelan economy. So it is difficult to say to what extent it's actually giving significant profits to Russia or to Rosneft, but definitely there is some kind of investment Russia cares about that are there in Venezuela. On the other hand, the important factors is actually the political support that Russia provides to Venezuela. Russia still maintains its power as the permanent member of the United Nations, so in any case scenario that may threaten Venezuelan interests, there is no doubt that Russia will use its veto power to block any resolution which would threaten interest of Maduro. And the arms sales, which has been one of the most important motivators for the Russian military-industrial complex, because it actually has been gaining important grounds in Venezuela for a long time.
Victor, is this an imbalanced relationship? In other words, does Venezuela and Maduro need Russia more than Russia needs Venezuela?
Well, it's difficult to define. If you would ask it 2 years before, I would say that Maduro needs more, who needs more Russia than Russia needs Maduro, because, well, we still need the billions of dollars invested into Venezuelan economy, but 20 millions is not enough price to maintain any kind of government. But we are living in 2018 when we have a almost full-scale confrontation between Russia and the West. So political significance of Maduro is forcing Moscow to maintain him, even if it means to invest more billions of dollars. His importance for Russia became more significant right now.
So, Vladimir, beyond Venezuela, can you talk a bit, and I'll ask you to weigh in as well, Victor, about Russia's interests regionally beyond that singular country?
Well, Russia is interested in Latin America once again because of its geographical proximity to the United States. And it's not something new. The foreign policy conducted by Vladimir Putin has incorporated a lot of the Soviet legacy. And we know from the times of the Soviet Union that Soviet Union was interested in Latin America primarily because of its geographical proximity to the United States. On the other hand, Russia, which is finding itself more and more isolated from the international community, the fact that
Russia does. So
Russia does
shares that in common with Venezuela.
Yes, it shares it with common with Venezuela, but differently to Venezuela, Russia still managed to maintain stable relation with all Latin America. Russian citizens, for example, can travel visa-free almost everywhere in Latin America, and there has been different and each time more diverse contact between Russia and Latin America. So there is a lot of going on besides Venezuela in the relation between Russia and Latin America.
Any additional thoughts on Russia?
Yes, well, I would add one more reason. A relationship with Venezuela is a kind of internal political show for Russians. That Russian political leadership is using kind of formula, make Russia great again, and Venezuela is a clear demonstration, and we have allies. We have persons and governments who can share our vision of multipolar world. So Venezuela is really something to care about. Not only Venezuela, and Venezuela definitely is not the same as Brazil means for Russia, but Venezuela is one of the few Latin American countries who still insist in the necessity to for the world to become more multipolar. Not unipolar one, and Russia is going to support any country which is in favor of that kind of international relations.
What is the likelihood or possibility that Venezuela or perhaps Latin America more broadly would become another bone of contention between the U.S. and Russia, become a hot point or a flashpoint?
It's highly likely.
It's highly likely. What are you watching in that regard? Where are the areas where this is likely to bubble up?
Well, actually, not all Latin America, obviously it was a joke, but Venezuela and in a lesser extent ALBA countries, with exception of Ecuador, and then still in less degree Cuba, because Cuba is not going to repeat the former experience, and Russia doesn't want to repeat Soviet experience in Cuba. It was too costly economically and politically, but Venezuela is the center of this possible confrontation.
Well, that's hopeful. At least the Cuba Cold War experience won't be repeated.
I hope so too.
We hope so. What are your thoughts on this potential conflict, area of conflict for these two countries?
I think that Russia's relations with Latin America will be determined by the state of Russia's relation with the West and primarily with the United States. So obviously Russia does not have the same level of relation with all Latin America. Venezuela is one, Nicaragua is another one. I think we have to watch closely what will be happening in Nicaragua, because the level of trust built between Russia and the government of Daniel Ortega is extremely high. I believe Russians can do a lot of things they cannot do anywhere else, but they do it in Nicaragua, especially in the terms of military presence there. And I think Nicaragua, in that sense, replaced Cuba during the Cold War because, as Victor was saying, it's difficult to expect that Cuba or Russia, for that sense, will be prepared to do what the Soviet Union did during the times of the Cold War. But Nicaragua actually is a new focal point for Russia in Latin America. And Russia will still try to maintain stable relations with the rest of the countries, especially important countries like Argentina. We know that despite of the change of the government and the change of regime that occurred in Argentina, Russia still maintains relatively stable relations with Argentina, and Russian media are present in Argentina despite of everything.
Speaking of other countries, one factor we haven't discussed, you mentioned the notion of multipolarity, China and their interests in the region and where they may overlap with these other great powers. What are your thoughts on the China factor, and how does this factor into this equation?
Well, I know for sure that Russia does observe what China is doing in Latin America, and China does observe what Russia is doing in Latin America. In some sense, they are learning from each other's experiences. For example, China is watching closely the success story of RT media and Sputnik networks in Latin America, and they're trying to replicate. But of course, Russia is also well aware that they cannot compete with China in terms of investment that China is able to provide to Latin America. So I think there have been kind of a division of labor to a certain extent, because China is, of course, building and maintaining their relations because of the strong trade ties and because of the investments, while Russia is actually applying a lot of instrument of soft power, like once again RT, Sputnik networks, and even now building more relation with the Russian diaspora that reside in Latin America.
Do we know how China's influence in Venezuela compares to Russia's?
Economically, well, China has much more investment made in Venezuela. It's about $60-65 billion.
Compared to the 20 for Russia.
Yeah, and about 20 of those billions will already return to China. They were already paid, but still 40 billions of debt, Venezuelan debt to China. And China has strong presence in Venezuela's oil and gas industries. It has a big presence in military sector. It also sells arms to Venezuela. Actually, now China sells more arms than Russia does. But China is also trying to penetrate other sectors of Venezuelan industry, such as communications and transportation system. That's what Russia doesn't want to do at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Gentlemen, a final thought about what you see in terms of trend lines. For people who are trying to track this and look at Russia's involvement in Latin America and in Venezuela, what are the key areas, the key issues that they should be paying attention to moving forward? We'll start with you, Victor, and then we'll give Vladimir the last word, since we mixed up the way we started the discussion.
Okay.
Well, definitely Russia is dividing different lines of its foreign policy. Economical one, which is the case of Argentina or Brazil or Ecuador, and political one, which is mostly Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia, in a lesser extent Cuba. The second line is Russian seek for constructing multipolar world. In that case, it's not necessary only to maintain political ties, but also economical ones. And the third one is a kind of geopolitical presence, to demonstrate that we are near your borders. We can be here for more times. We are not going to start a new war, but remember that we always are watching up to you.
Mm-hmm. The powerful final word for our discussion.
Okay, I think it's very clear that Russia is determined to maintain its presence in Latin America. It is well aware of the limited resources that it has to invest in Latin America. So what Russia will do is further diversify the ways of its engagement. In Venezuela or Nicaragua, it may be some limited economical help, but in some other places it will be the extension of the Russian media. I think Russia will also be watching very closely how the relation between Latin American countries and the United States will be developing, and it's an opportunist, so it will look for opportunity to expand its influence depending on how the relation of these countries with the U.S. will be developing in the future.
Gentlemen, thank you for sharing your insights with us today, and I want to tell our viewers that if you're interested in more on the topic, if you go to the Kennan Institute's webpage, you'll see both of our guests involved in a larger discussion, a longer discussion, in a conference that's upcoming. And the magic of time travel, I'm plugging this before it happens, because you're going to do that tomorrow. So good luck with that, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.